chalk was still on her fingers when the pack's third warrior found her crouching in the gap between the grain stores and the eastern wall, her knees against cold stone, her breath making small clouds in the November dark. She had been marking again. The warrior, a broad man named Aldrin, who smelled of wood smoke and cheap ale, grabbed her by the back of her collar and pulled her upright like she weighed nothing. She did weigh nothing. That was the thing about Wren, that no one talked about directly, but everyone noticed in the way they sometimes notice a sick animal in a field. She was 23 years old, and she had the body of someone who had been fed just enough for a very long time to keep going. "The wall," Aldrin said. He jerked his chin at the marks. Again, the letters were neat and precise, pressed into the stone in the white chalk she kept in the knotted hem of her sleeve. Her right hand, always her right. The left one didn't work properly anymore. The fingers locked at wrong angles from the morning 3 years ago when the pack's former enforcer had slammed a door on it during an argument she had not been part of. No one had set the bones. No one had thought to try. The message read, "The south cistern is poisoned. Something has gotten into the casing. Do not drink from it." Aldrin stared at the words. He stared at her. She looked back at him with those light brown eyes that always unsettled people who looked too long. Not because they were strange, but because they were too steady, too watchful, the eyes of something that had learned to observe everything while appearing to notice nothing. She was not mute. That was the part people always got wrong about Wren. She could speak. She had a voice, low and a little rough, that she had used exactly 4 times in the past 2 months, each time to say something brief and necessary, and each time to be ignored or spoken over or told to go back to the kitchen. She had stopped wasting it. She had started writing instead. "Wash it off," Aldrin said. He was already turning away. "Before the warden sees, you know what happened last time." She knew. Last time the warden, a thin-shouldered man named Corrigan, who kept meticulous records of things that benefited him and lost everything else, had docked her food allotment for 2 weeks for defacing pack property, which had survived on kitchen scraps and the occasional mercy of the head cook, a woman named Bess, who sometimes left bread on the lower shelf, where Wren could reach it without being seen. Bess never acknowledged this, but Wren never thanked her for it. It was an arrangement conducted entirely in peripheral vision, and it was the closest thing to kindness Wren had known in 11 years. Her name was Wren, not her birth name, that had been lost with everything else when she arrived at Duskwall at age 7, a small and silent child passed along from a northern territory that no one at Duskwall wanted to ask too many questions about. She had no wolf. She had no family. Was Omega in the strictest and most punishing sense of the word, and she had been treated accordingly. But she could see things, not visions, nothing so dramatic. It was more like pattern recognition at a level that her brain seemed to process faster than thought. She noticed the slight discoloration in the water that came from the south cistern 3 days before anyone else registered the smell. She noticed the stress fractures in the watchtower's northeast corner post months before the timber inspector came and confirmed the rot. She noticed the subtle shift in the pack's grain supply, the weight of the sacks wrong, the flour leaving a faint grey residue on her palms, and wrote the warning on the east corridor wall a full week before Corrigan reluctantly ordered an audit and found that 1/3 of the stores had been adulterated with ground limestone dust. Every warning had been accurate. Not one had been acknowledged. They simply scrubbed the walls and punished her for the chalk marks, because acknowledging that the silent Omega who slept in the corner of the supply room knew things she shouldn't know would require acknowledging that she was something other than a useful piece of furniture. And Duskwall had decided what she was a long time ago. But she washed the wall herself with a damp cloth and a bucket of water that was too cold for the temperature outside. Her reflection in the dark surface was a smear of short dark hair and sharp cheekbones. She hadn't eaten yet today. The day before she'd eaten half a bowl of leftover porridge that Bess had slid to the edge of the counter, and the day before that, nothing, because Corrigan had discovered she'd been using leftover candle stubs to read after dark, and he'd considered that a waste of pack resources. She carried the bucket back to the supply room and set it down and listened. Castle, Duskwall Keep technically, though no one called it that in conversation, was different tonight. She could feel it in the way the air moved through the corridors, in the way the voices of the warriors in the lower hall had a different pitch than usual. Not louder, tighter. The sound of people trying to seem relaxed. Something was coming. Found out what at dawn, when Bess shook her awake by tapping her foot twice. That was the signal, 2 taps, because Bess had never grabbed her by the hair the way some of the others did, and Wren had noticed that too, but filed it away in the careful inventory she kept of people who were slightly less cruel than they could have been. The Alpha of the Northern Reach arrives today. Bess didn't whisper it like a secret. She said it the way you say things that are both true and terrible. He does his circuit of the border packs every year. Duskwall is on the route. You understand what that means? Wren understood. Every pack member presented, every record reviewed, every corner of every pack exposed to the eyes of the man who held authority over all of them. She had written his name once, in the dust, on the floor of the supply room, very small, in the corner where the light didn't reach, not a warning. Something else, a question, maybe, or a habit, because for the past 8 months she'd been dreaming about him, and in the dreams she was always standing in a room with stone walls, and there was a man reading something written on those walls, and his expression was not of the careful disinterest she'd learned to expect from people who looked at her. He was reading like the words mattered, like she mattered. She'd wiped the name away immediately. Thinking about the Alpha of the Northern Reach felt dangerous, like reaching toward something hot, not because of what he was, but because of what wanting something did to you when you had spent 11 years learning not to want. She pulled on her better shirt, the one with fewer visible mends, and tied her hair back and went to start the kitchen fires. There was nothing she could do about the thinness of her wrists, or the way the cold always left her fingers slightly blue, or the faded scar that ran from the corner of her left eye down to her jaw, a souvenir from the 2nd year at Duskwall, when a drunk warrior had thrown a clay pot at the wall, and the shards had found her face. She was what she was. She'd stopped apologizing for it. The keep spent the morning in frantic motion. Warriors polished things. Corrigan walked in rapid circles, making lists. Pack Alpha Grenthon, a man who had inherited his position and his father's bad decisions, and done nothing interesting with either. Rehearsed his greeting speech in the great hall in a voice that had never in Wren's memory conveyed genuine authority, and peeled turnips and scrubbed the breakfast pots and listened. She always listened. It was the main advantage of being consistently underestimated. People forgot she was there. They talked over her and around her, and she heard everything. She heard Corrigan telling Aldrin that the records from the past 4 years had been revised to show a higher output rate than Duskwall had actually produced, that the shortfall had been quietly covered by redirecting supplies meant for the border settlements. She heard 2 warriors near the fire mention that Grenton had been taking payments from a southern merchant operation in exchange for access to Duskwall's trade routes without declaring those payments to the Reach's central accounts. She heard Bess muttering about the state of the guest provisions and the fact that there wasn't enough decent food in the keep to feed the Alpha's retinue without embarrassing them all, because Grenthon had been spending the supply budget on things Bess declined to specify, but said with a tone that made her meaning entirely clear, and set down the turnip knife and pressed her chalk-dusted fingers flat against the work table. This was different from a poisoned cistern. This was different from limestone in the flour. What she had just heard was fraud. Systematic, documented, intentional, and it touched the Reach's own resources, which meant it touched the Alpha directly. Waited until the keep emptied into the courtyard for the arrival formation. Bess gave her a long, steady look before leaving. "Stay in the kitchen. Stay out of the way. They don't present Omegas. You know that." Wren nodded. She waited until Bess's footsteps faded. Then she took out the chalk and went to find a wall. She chose the corridor outside the records room. Pale stone, smooth chalk showed on it clearly. She wrote quickly and cleanly, the way she'd been doing for 8 months, which let her the same careful height. The pack's output records have been falsified for 4 years. Border settlement allocations were redirected. The documentation is inside the locked records room, second shelf, green ledgers. She stepped back and looked at it. Then, because her hand was still moving, and there was more wall and 11 years of silence that had the weight of something physical pressing on the inside of her chest, she kept writing. Pack Alpha has been accepting undeclared payments from the Caro trading operation. 3 years of transactions. The receipts are in his private room in the iron lockbox beneath the south window. She stopped, stepped back, looked at both messages. She should go back to the kitchen. Instead, she crouched down and wrote one more thing, very small at the base of the wall where it met the floor, the letters barely the height of her thumbnail. "I have been here the whole time," pressed her palm flat against the wall beside it. A print, chalk white on pale stone, and then she went back to the kitchen and washed her hands and tucked herself into the corner behind the barrel of salted pork and waited. Through the narrow window above the barrel, she could see the courtyard. She could see the pack assembled in their ranks, the warriors stiff in armor that didn't quite fit anymore, the civilians standing behind them with expressions of people who had practiced looking neutral. She could see Grenthon at the front, his ceremonial fur cloak slightly too long, dragging in the frost-stiffened mud. Then she saw him. The Alpha of the Northern Reach arrived through the gate on foot, was taller than she had expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, some combination of legend and her own strange dreams, with the broad-shouldered build of someone who had been trained hard for a very long time and had not stopped. He wore dark grey travelling clothes, no armour, a long coat that moved with him rather than against him. His hair was dark, cut close at the sides. There was a scar across the bridge of his nose and another visible above his collar, pale against his throat. His name was Kale. She had written it in dust and erased it, and she was not supposed to know it felt like something when she said it in her own head. He stopped inside the gate. His head moved in one clean arc, scanning the assembled pack, the walls, the courtyard. Not the look of someone performing authority, but of someone actually registering information. She knew that look. She'd been doing the same thing since she was 7 years old. The look of someone who had learned that the world would not tell you what you needed to know. You had to take it yourself. Then his scan stopped. It stopped on the kitchen window, on her. She was 2 meters back from the glass, barely visible. She knew that. She had spent 11 years making herself barely visible, and yet his eyes found the window and stayed there, and the expression on his face changed in a way she couldn't read from this distance, but that made something in her chest do something she had no word for. He said something to the woman beside him, short silver hair, capable posture, the look of someone who managed things and did not need to be told twice. The woman looked at the kitchen window and saw nothing. Anton reached Kale with his rehearsed greeting, and Kale turned to look at him the way you look at something you need to move out of your way. "Later," Kale said, one word, a complete sentence. He walked past the Pack Alpha, past the formation, past the assembled keep. He walked toward the kitchen door with the unhurried precision of a man who had already decided where he was going. Wren pressed herself back against the barrel. Her heart was doing something loud and inconvenient. The door opened quietly. His footsteps on the stone floor were measured and even. She heard him stop. She heard him stand still for a moment. "I know there's someone behind there," he said. His voice was different than she'd expected. Lower, less performative. Not the voice of someone used to being obeyed, the voice of someone used to being alone in his own head with very little company. "You don't have to come out." "But I'm not leaving." She believed him, but she came out. But she stepped around the barrel, and they were in the same small kitchen, and he was very much taller than she was, and his eyes were dark grey, almost charcoal, and they were looking at her the way she had spent 11 years looking at things, actually looking, registering, taking inventory, without flinching from what the inventory showed. He looked at her wrists, her left hand, a scar by her eye, the shirt that had been mended more times than it had been new, chalk residue on her right palm that she hadn't completely scrubbed away. His expression did not change. That was the strange thing. No careful performance of sympathy, no visible discomfort at what the inventory was showing him. He looked at her the way someone looks at a calculation that has come out wrong, and is now going to find out exactly which step produced the error and why. "Who are you?" he said. Her mouth opened. She said, without planning to, "Wren." He repeated it, not as a question, like he was settling the word into place. "Then what were you writing on the wall?" She held out her chalk-dusted right hand. Then she pointed at the door. He followed her, but she led him through the kitchen and down the corridor to the pale stone wall, and he stopped in front of her messages and read. She watched his face while he read, but she saw the particular stillness that came over him when he reached the line about the falsified output records. She saw his jaw set when he got to the part about the redirected border allocations. She watched his hands, large hands, knuckles with the specific callous pattern of someone who had trained with a weapon for years, close and open at his sides when he read about Grenthon's undeclared payments. Then he crouched down, found the small message at the base of the wall where it met the floor. He stayed crouched for a long moment. "I have been here the whole time." He touched the chalk-white palm print beside it, one finger tracing the outline of it, not rubbing it away, just acknowledging it. He stood up, turned to look at her. His grey eyes had something in them now that had not been there when he walked through the gate, not softer exactly, but present in a different way, the way a room looks different when someone turns on the light in it. "How long have you been writing warnings?" he said. 8 months, she said. The voice came out rough from underuse, but it was there. And how many of them were right? She looked at him steadily. All of them. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he said quietly, "I believe you." Something cracked open inside her chest. Not dramatically, not the way things crack in stories. A quiet opening, like a door that has been stuck a long time finally shifting a centimetre on its hinges. Before she could speak again, footsteps, multiple sets, rapid, the clatter of Corrigan's precise boots, and Grenthon's heavier tread and 2 warriors behind them. "Your Excellency." Grenthon's voice was performing calm over something that was not calm at all. The eastern corridor. "We've been doing some restoration work." Cale did not turn around. "The cistern," he said, still looking at Wren. "Was it contaminated?" Silence. The watchtower post. The northeast corner. Was there structural rot? More silence. Grain stores. Limestone adulteration. True or false? Wren heard Corrigan's breathing change. But she had been listening to people's breathing change for 11 years, and she knew what that particular shift meant. The sound of someone discarding options rapidly. "These things can have innocent explanations," Corrigan said smoothly. "The Omega is unstable. She fixates on perceived problems. We've had her assessed." "When?" Cale said. His tone was pleasant in the way that flat stone is pleasant, but smooth and very hard. "When exactly was she assessed? And by whom, and where are those records?" Corrigan's smooth voice developed a fault line. Cale turned around then. He looked at Grenthon and Corrigan, and the 2 warriors behind them with the same flat, assessing look he'd used on the courtyard, the one that registered everything and was not moved by any of it. Then he looked at Wren. "Stay here," he said. Not an order, something else, a promise that he would be back. Walked toward Grenthon and Corrigan, and the temperature in the corridor seemed to shift. "Open the records room," he said. "Now, I will send to the Reach for an extraction team, and you will explain to them why it needed to be forced. Your choice. Make it quickly." They opened the records room. The green ledgers were exactly where Wren had said they were. Cale and his silver-haired second. Her name was Ivan. Wren would learn later, spent 40 minutes in the records room. Wren waited in the corridor. No one told her to leave. No one told her to stay. She stood in the space between visible and not visible that she had occupied for most of her life, and she listened to the sound of pages turning and Ivan making quiet notes and Grenthon in the corner of the room making the sound of a man understanding that something is very much over. Every few minutes, Cale glanced through the open door. Each time his eyes found her, each time something in his expression did the small thing that she had no name for. He was checking that she was still there. She stayed. When he came back into the corridor, he stood in front of her and said, "Pack Alpha Grenthon is being removed. Corrigan too. They'll both answer for this at the Reach." She nodded. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You're coming with me?" Her heart did the inconvenient loud thing again. She could not read his face precisely enough to know what he meant by it, and she was not going to assume, and she was not going to let herself want, so she opened her mouth and said carefully, "Why?" "Because," he said, and the word was very quiet. "You've been right 8 months in a row, and you've been treated like you were the problem. And because—" He stopped. He looked at the chalk print on the wall. He looked back at her. "And because my wolf has been making a particular noise for the past 2 years that I have not been able to account for, and it stopped the moment I walked through that gate." Wren's mouth opened. No sound came out. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she needed to. She did not step back. His hand was warm, and the calluses on his palm were rough against the back of her hand when he turned it gently over and looked at her locked fingers. "Who did this?" he said. She told him, but in detail. Her voice still rationed itself in crisis messages and short sentences, 11 years of habit not broken in one corridor. But she told him enough. The door, the enforcer, the fact that no one had set the bones afterward. She watched his jaw work. She watched him put it away somewhere behind his grey eyes and hold it there with the particular controlled force of a man accustomed to receiving information that required a response he was not going to make in front of an audience. He did not let go of her hand when Grenthon and Corrigan and the 2 warriors came back into the corridor. "She is pack property," Grenthon said, "bonded in service. She cannot—" "She is not property," Cale said. His voice had no heat in it whatsoever. That was what made it effective. It was a flat statement of fact from someone who had already decided it was true and was simply informing you. Grenthon's mouth kept moving. Cale waited until it stopped. "You," he said to Ivan, "arrange transport." And he looked at Wren. "Can you walk?" She almost said something dry. She almost said she'd been walking on worse floors than this, in worse shoes than these for 11 years. She said instead, "Yes." The carriage was at the back of Cale's convoy, one of 3, solid and dark, with wool blankets piled on the bench inside. The van handed Wren a bowl of lamb stew from the supply wagon without ceremony and pointed at the carriage door and said, "Eat, sleep if you can. We move out within the hour." Then sat in the carriage with the bowl of stew and ate it in small, careful bites because her body didn't quite trust food yet when it was given without conditions. It was good stew. The lamb was actual lamb, not the grey approximation of lamb she'd been eating at Duskwall for years. There were carrots. She ate 2 full bowls and then a piece of bread, and then sat with the empty bowl in her hands and stared at the floor of the carriage, and felt the thing she had not let herself feel in 11 years, because feeling it required believing in a future in which it would matter. She was out of Duskwall. She was warm. She had eaten. The van came back after the convoy started moving and sat across from her and opened a notebook and said without looking up, "He has been doing these circuit reviews for 2 years. Every border pack. He normally sends representatives but started coming himself after his wolf." She paused. He'll tell you himself if he wants to. But he's been looking for something, and it's been expensive in time, and it's been hard on him. You should know that." Wren looked at Ivan. Ivan looked up from her notebook. "You're wondering why I'm telling you this," Wren said. "Yes, because," Ivan said, going back to her notes, "you wrote warnings on the walls for 8 months and no one listened, and I want you to know that we are listening." She paused. "Also, the stew wagon has more bread if you need it. Tell me and I'll get it." She fell asleep in the carriage without intending to. The warmth and the food and the accumulated weight of 11 years of doing this alone came down on her all at once, and she lay down on the bench and was asleep before the afternoon had finished. When she woke, it was evening. The carriage was still moving. Cale was sitting across from her, coat off, reading something in the last of the daylight, through the window, one hand braced on the sill for balance. He looked up when she stirred. "I've been asleep for 3 hours," he said. "We're making camp soon." He paused. "Ivan is aggressively protective of your rest and has told me twice not to wake you. I want you to know I did not wake you. I merely sat here." She looked at him. He looked back. He had the kind of face that was composed by default, the resting expression of someone who had spent a long time not giving things away. But the composure was not the same as the Corrigan kind, the careful neutrality of a man managing angles. It was quieter than that, more tired. But she said, "Your wolf stopped howling when you came through the gate." He was very still for a moment, then, "Yes," she said, "mine did something when I saw you through the window." He was still again, but differently. The tiredness shifted into something else. She wasn't experienced enough with having things to know exactly what the expression meant, but she'd spent 11 years reading people who didn't know she was watching, and she was fairly confident it meant that he had been hoping she would say that. "I don't have a wolf," she said. "I've never shifted. I've never felt anything that suggested one was. I mean, the pack at Duskwall told me I was wolfless. They said that was why She stopped, pressed her right hand flat against her sternum over the place where whatever it was had moved when she'd looked through the kitchen window at him. "Can you feel that?" she said. The pulling. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his grey eyes focused. He said, "I felt it for 2 years, and yes, right now it is considerably louder than it usually is." She looked at him for a long time, and she opened the small journal that Ivan had left on the bench beside her. She hadn't noticed it before. A good leather cover, clean pages, and a proper pen, not a chalk stub, and she wrote something and held it up. The journal said, "I want to understand what I am. I have been told the wrong thing my whole life, and I want to know what's true." He read it, he said. "Then we find out together." They travelled for 3 days, and slept in the carriage on the first night, and in a proper camp bed on the second and third, under wool blankets that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. She ate 3 meals each day from the convoy's cook, a meticulous man named Bram, who took personal offence at the state of Duskwall's pantry and spent the first evening composing a lengthy monologue on the subject to anyone within earshot. Cale came to the carriage every evening. He sat across from her and talked, not about pack administration, or the records he'd seized from Duskwall, or the investigation Ivan was already running from the supply wagon. He talked about his mother, who had kept a reference map of every bird she'd ever identified, and who had believed that the most careful attention to small things was the best defense against being surprised by large ones. He talked about his wolf, who was unreasonable in the mornings, and who had once howled at a full council session with such force that the Reach's oldest senior councillor had spilled an entire pot of tea on himself. She wrote responses in the journal. Short at first, she had been writing warnings in crisis format for so long that making sentences for no tactical reason felt like a different language. Gradually longer. She wrote, "Does your wolf howl at council sessions often, or was that a singular event?" He said, "For 2 years it happened at least twice monthly." She wrote, "That seems like it would affect your productivity." He said, "The council adapted. They began every meeting by laying out a towel for Councillor Fenn. She wrote, "That's actually efficient." She almost smiled. Her face felt strange doing it. On the second night, he asked about the dreams. "But you knew I was coming before I arrived," he said. What a question. The way he said things that were true. She wrote in the journal for a while. Then she held it up. "I dreamed of a man in a stone room, reading things written on walls. I could never see his face clearly. But his hands were shaking while he read, and then he was saying a name. Not a name I knew, but it felt like mine. I kept waking up and writing down the details, and then not knowing what to do with them." He read it twice. He sat very still, and he said, "I dreamed about chalk on stone floors every time. 8 months of dreams with chalk marks on stone floors, and I never—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "I thought it was the wolf. I thought he was doing something metaphorical." She wrote, "Wolves are rarely metaphorical." He laughed. An actual, genuine laugh, sudden and low, that changed his face completely. It erased the composure and the tiredness, and left something that was younger and more surprised at itself. She thought, "I want to do that again," and then she thought, "I am in serious trouble." On the third day they arrived at the Reach. Not a castle, a compound on a hill above a river valley, old stone and newer timber and walls, covered in creeping vines that had been growing long enough to be structural. It was alive in a way Duskwall had never been, warm and layered with the smell of generations of a pack that had stayed in one place long enough to mean it. Ivan told her the healers were ready. Kale had sent word ahead. The Reach's head healer was a compact woman named Suri with close-cropped grey hair and an expression of professional assessment that Wren found reassuring precisely because it was not trying to be kind. But Suri looked at Wren the way. Wren looked at the marks on a wall. Data first, interpretation after. The examination was thorough and uncomfortable and took most of the morning. Kale stood in the corner the whole time. He didn't interfere. He didn't look away. Simply present in the way that large, stable things are present, like a wall that knows it is a wall, and Wren found that she could tolerate the examination in a way she wouldn't have been able to alone. When Suri was done, she sat back and looked at Kale with an expression that had moved past assessment into something that looked like controlled anger. "Her wolf," Suri said, "is intact. She has full wolf potential. Not suppressed by absence, but suppressed by interference. Someone placed a binding on her, a layered one. Voice was left intact, but wolf was locked below threshold. She has never been able to feel it clearly." She said it the way she'd been saying everything, precise and flat and not pointing the anger anywhere until she'd finished the sentence. The binding was placed when she was very young, 5 or 6 years old. It's grown in around her, the way bone grows around a break that was never set. The room was quiet. "Can it be removed?" Kale said. "Carefully, slowly." Suri looked at Wren. "It will take time. The unbinding process will feel." She chose the word, deliberately, significant. "Your wolf has been pressing against this for 17 years. When it releases, she will come forward all at once." Wren wrote in the journal, "Who would do this to a child?" Suri read it, passed it to Kale. Kale read it, set his jaw in the particular way she was learning to recognize as the thing his face did when something made him furious that he was not going to express until he was alone. Then he said, "That is what we are going to find out." The investigation took 6 days. Van ran it with 2 archivists, pulling records from the Reach's historical registry and from the administrative remnants of a pack called Ironhaven, which had been dissolved 17 years ago when its alpha was killed in a border dispute. The official version said the border dispute had been with a rival pack's rogue faction. What Ivan found in the secondary records, buried in the transfer documents of 3 different administrative periods, was something else. Ironhaven's alpha had been a woman named Allison. She had been known for 2 things. She was one of very few female alphas in that generation, and her wolf. The record described it in terms that made Ivan ask Suri to come read it directly. Had been silver-white, the only color in the historical record associated with what the old accounts called a clarity wolf, a wolf that saw true. Alison had had a daughter. The daughter was 5 when Ironhaven was dissolved. The daughter's name was Lyra. The information came to Wren in the late afternoon on the 6th day. She was sitting in the stone courtyard near the well, writing nothing in particular in her journal. A description of the way the light moved across the wall at this hour, the slow shift from gold to grey that happened between 3 and 4 o'clock in November. She was writing it for no reason except that she could, that she had a journal and a pen, and no one was going to take them from her, and the pleasure of that was still new enough to feel like holding something she had not yet learned not to be afraid of losing. Cale sat down beside her, close. The pull between them had become something she was learning to simply live alongside, the way you learn to live alongside a sound that is constant and not unpleasant. "We found your name," he said. "Your real one." She looked up. Lyra. Her mother was Alison of Ironhaven. She had a clarity wolf, one that saw patterns that others missed. The records describe it as white. He paused. "Like you, if you had ever been allowed to shift." She turned the name over in her mind. Lyra. She pressed it against the inside of her chest and felt the way it fit differently than Wren, the way Wren was a garment she'd been handed, and Lyra was something that had been waiting for her to grow back into it. "Ironhaven wasn't dissolved," he said. "It was taken. Someone wanted the territory and feared your mother's wolf. They arranged her death and they took you, and they bound your wolf because you carried the same bloodline, and then they handed you to a border pack as an unclaimed child and waited for time and neglect to finish what they'd started." She was shaking, not visibly, a fine internal shaking that she'd learned to contain 11 years ago, the kind that started somewhere around the diaphragm and radiated outward. She opened the journal. Her handwriting was less neat than usual. "I have been writing warnings for 8 months," she wrote. "Every 3rd warning, I noticed afterward. The first letter of the 2nd word in each one. I thought it was a coincidence. I thought it was habit." She held it up. Cale read it. His expression went very still. He took the journal gently from her. He looked at the last few messages she'd written down, the ones she'd transcribed from memory. He said L, then he said YRA. He looked up. "Your wolf," he said quietly. "She has been writing your name into the warnings, hiding it there, like a signal, like something trying to be found." Wren pressed her hand against her mouth, her left hand, one with the locked fingers. She could feel the pulling in her chest doing something she had no word for, something urgent and very old. "I am going to find who did this," Cale said, "and they will answer for it. But right now I need you to know." He stopped. He looked at the journal in his hands, at her handwriting, at the careful letters that her wolf had apparently been using for months to scratch her own name into the record. He looked at her. "You have been here the whole time," he said. "Someone tried very hard to make sure no one knew that. They didn't manage it. The tears came. She let them. He didn't reach for her. He stayed in his place, solid and present, the way the wall of the courtyard was present, and she found that this was exactly what she needed, to cry in front of someone who was going to stay in the room. Suri removed the binding over the course of 9 days. Daily sessions in a low-ceilinged room that smelled of dried yarrow and beeswax. Each session left Wren feeling like she had been taken apart carefully and put back together slightly more correctly. An interior soreness in places she hadn't known she had interior. After the 4th session, she felt something shift behind her sternum, not the pull of the bond. Something underneath it. Something that moved and then went still. Like an animal that has been dormant long enough that it doesn't know, yet it's been freed. After the 6th session, she dreamed of white. On the 9th day, Suri told her the binding would break on its own. "The work is done," she said. "Now we wait for your wolf. When she comes, she will come fully. Be somewhere with space." Wren chose the north field. Just after dawn, the frost still white on the grass, the air sharp and clean in the specific way that northern air gets in late November. She stood in the middle of the field with her hands at her sides and waited. It broke like ice on a river. The crack was internal and enormous, and she felt it everywhere simultaneously. Spine, jaw, the soles of her feet on the frozen ground, and then the thing that had been pressing against the inside of her chest for 23 years pressed through, and Lyra opened her mouth and howled. The sound that came out of her was not a human sound. It came from a place deeper than lungs, deeper than throat, and it went up and out into the November morning and kept going, carrying the full weight of 17 years of something that had been waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. She shifted, but she had never done it before, and she did it completely, the bones rearranging with a force that erased everything else. And when it was done and she was still, it was on 4 feet, and the world was sharper and more layered and utterly different than anything she had experienced in 23 years of human senses. The wolf that stood in the north field was white, but grey, not pale. White, the white of birch bark and fresh snow and the center of a flame, and her eyes were the same light brown they had always been in her human body, and they were blazing with something that was too large to call relief and too old to call joy. She howled again. Cale came as his wolf. She felt him before she saw him, the pull of the bond, suddenly enormous, like a rope that had been slack for years going taut all at once. It came over the field's low ridge in the form of a wolf the color of dark water, large and scarred and moving at a pace that suggested he had been somewhere nearby the whole time. He stopped in front of her. His wolf lowered its head. She pressed her muzzle to his. The bond between them lit up like fire in a cold room, and she felt him on the other side of it. Not just near her, actually present in the way that the bond made possible, his heartbeat and his relief, and the particular quality of 2 years of looking for something, and finally, actually finding it. They stayed in the field for a long time. Evan found the truth on the 11th day. The pack responsible for Ironhaven's dissolution was called Greymare. Alpha had wanted Ironhaven's northern grazing routes and had feared Alison's Clarity Wolf enough to arrange the kill rather than negotiate. He had hired someone to place the binding on 5-year-old Lyra and had passed her along the border pack network with falsified papers and a new name. He had kept watch every few years through intermediaries. Strangers passing through Duskwall with questions about the mute Omega in the supply room, confirming that she was still silent, still bounded, still nothing. The Alpha was 71 years old. Still in position. Cale received this information at his desk, with Lyra across from him, sitting in the chair that was still sometimes a surprise to her. The fact of being in a room with someone because she was meant to be there, rather than because she had made herself invisible enough to remain. She wrote in her journal, "I want to be there." He read it. "You'll be there." They went to Greymare with a party of 200. Lyra rode beside Cale on a grey mare that Evan had chosen for her, in riding clothes and proper boots, her hair braided and her scar visible because she had decided a long time ago that she was done hiding the parts of her face that had been caused by other people's carelessness. And she was not about to start again now. The Alpha of Greymare, Varen, grey-haired, with the careful posture of someone accustomed to authority by proximity rather than nature, met them at the gate. He looked at Lyra. His expression moved through several things in rapid succession and landed on something that was not quite remorse and not quite relief, but occupied the space between them. A calculation reaching its end. "Alpha Alison of Ironhaven," Cale said. "You arranged her death, you stole her territory. You bound her daughter's wolf when she was 5 years old and handed her to a border pack to disappear." He paused. She didn't disappear. Varon's eyes were on Lyra, who stood her mare still and looked back at him steadily, with the eyes she had inherited from a mother she had no memory of, and the composure she had built over 23 years of having nothing. "She looks like Alison," Varen said quietly. "Not to anyone in particular, she has her mother's way of standing." Lyra thought, "I have my mother's wolf. I have my mother's eyes. I have the ability she had to see what others miss, and I used it for 8 months writing warnings on the walls of a pack that treated me as furniture, and none of that was erased by what you did to me." She did not say any of this, but she looked at Veron and let him look back at her and said nothing, because she had learned at a very early age that silence chosen was different from silence imposed. Veron had no answer for her steadiness. He looked away first. Claiming happened at Ironhaven. The territory was half reclaimed by years of neglect. The Alpha's house open to the sky, the walls covered in lichen, and the creeping vines that grew over everything in this part of the north if you gave it long enough. But the orchard was still there. Lisson had planted apple trees along the eastern edge of the property, and they were enormous now, old and gnarled and enormously themselves, and in the November frost their branches were bare and silver, and when the wind moved through them they made a sound like something breathing. Lyra stood in the orchard, bare feet on the frozen ground. By choice, because she'd spent 11 years with no shoes, and she discovered that the cold didn't bother the wolf, and the wolf was hers now, hers completely, and she was going to know every sensation available to her, starting from the ground up. Cale stood across from her, long coat off, sword absent, the markers of authority set aside, just a man with tired eyes and a scar across his nose and calloused hands that could cup her face with the same precision they used for everything else. He said, "Lyra, I want to mark you. I want to stand in front of every wolf in the Reach and say that you are mine and I am yours, but you spent 11 years having things decided for you by people who didn't ask. So I am asking, tell me yes or tell me no. Either answer, I stay." She looked at him, thought about the supply room and the chalk and the bucket of cold water and the 8 months of writing things that no one listened to and the stew that had been the best thing she'd ever tasted and the journal with clean pages and the field at dawn and the wolf coming through her like a door finally opening. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. He stepped forward, his hand curved around the back of her neck, warm and certain. But she tilted her head and felt his breath against the place where her shoulder met her throat, and then the bright, precise pain of the bite, and then the flood of warmth through the bond that was not like anything she had a word for, except, perhaps, a rival. She marked him in return. The teeth were less precise and considerably more determined. She felt him exhale, not pain, something else, the exhale of a man releasing a tension he had been carrying for 2 years without putting it down. He threw her head back and howled in the orchard of her mother's land, and the apple trees shook in the frost. They returned to the Reach 4 days later. The pack gathered in the great hall. 200 wolves and staff and 3 councillors, including the elderly councillor Fenn, looked at Lyra with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to being the most observant person in the room and finding that he was not. Cale said 4 words, "This is your Alpha." Silence. Councillor Fenn stood up. He did it slowly because his hip was bad and waved away the 2 attendants who moved to help him with the expression of a man who did not require assistance and was tired of being offered it. He said, "Knew of Allison of Ironhaven. Was 32 years old when Ironhaven fell, and I always thought the official account was incomplete." He looked at Lyra with the concentrated attention of someone filing an accurate record. "The right warnings, I'm told, that people ignored." She said, "Yes." He said, "We will not ignore them." He sat back down. Someone in the hall laughed, then someone else, and then the laughter resolved into something that was not deference. It was rougher than that, more honest. The sound of a pack making its own decision. Lyra did not address them. Her voice was returning, but not yet reliable for a hall this size. Instead, she did something else. She held up her left hand. The one with the locked fingers, the one that didn't work properly anymore, and she pressed the fist against her chest, over her heart. The gesture came from nowhere she could name. It came from the wolf, maybe, or from the 23 years of carrying things without being asked, or from the 8 months of writing the truth on walls in chalk and being told she was the problem. It was not a formal gesture. It meant simply, I am here, and I know what it costs to be here, and I am not leaving. The hall pressed their fists to their hearts, one at a time and then all at once, but learned to speak in the months that followed. Fully, steadily, in a voice that still had the rough underuse quality of something that had been quiet too long, and she kept the habit of the journal, filling volume after volume with observations and small, precise details. The way ice forms on the north side of stones differently than the south, the particular sound the orchard made in high wind, the number of apple trees her mother had planted, and the varieties of them, recovered from the old territory records and now propagated in the Reach's south garden. She slept in a room that was warm. She woke beside a man whose heartbeat she could feel through the bond at any distance. The pack smell of the Reach had changed, grown to include her in the way that old places include new things, not immediately, but thoroughly the way water includes stone if you give it long enough. And on the walls of Duskwall Keep, 200 kilometers north, the chalk marks had been painted over at Corrigan's order months ago, before any of this. But chalk is not blood. It is not permanent. What Lyra had written on those walls had done its work long before the paint covered it. The warnings were gone. She didn't need them anymore.